Hello everybody, welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be filling you in on everything I read in April and May. So these past couple of months I've read a total of 11 books. And in terms of genre, I read 8 horror books, some fantasy, science fiction, and some contemporary literary fiction. And some of these books I read for a couple videos I released in this time, so I won't talk too long about those books, but I encourage you to check out those videos if you want to know more of my thoughts. I'll talk about each in order of my favorite of the month, but before I do that, I'd like to tell you about some of my graphic novel reading from this month. Now, I'm not a big comic book reader, or rather, I haven't been since my college or high school years when I was a fan of Marvel Comics. I'd still consider myself a Marvel fan, but I haven't really read any comics in maybe 8 years. But in May, on a whim, I borrowed the first compendium of Spawn comics on Libby, including his origin story from the 90s, and I've been picking it up here and there. Now, if you aren't familiar, Spawn is a comic book character created by Todd McFarlane and published by Image Comics. And these first issues laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the most successful independent comic book ever. It's about Al Simmons, a military man who dies and makes a deal with the devil so that he can return to Earth to see his wife. But of course there is a catch when you make a deal with the devil and his memory is wiped and he is damned to be an anti-hero for the devil in New York. I've gotten through 11 issues so far, and I will say that the art is pretty incredible, all being illustrated by Todd McFarlane, who created some of the most iconic Spider-Man illustrations in the 80s and 90s. It is definitely a pretty corny story though, plot-wise, particularly in the issues that were written by Todd McFarlane. Which is most of them really in the end. But in these early issues, he enlisted help from other comic book writers and literary legends such as Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, and Frank Miller. Those issues that were guest written did end up being my favorites of those that I've read so far. But anyway, I don't think I really have much else to say here. I'm not going to rate my reading experience, but I am having a good time with it so far. It's been dark and a bit pulpy with some great artwork, so definitely a lot of fun for me. But now, let's get into everything else I read, starting off with my least favorite. First up is The Haunting of Velkwood by Gwendolyn Kist, which I read for my video on the Bram Stoker Awards, for which it was nominated for Best Novel. I already talked a bit about this novel in that video, but I didn't really get into why I didn't enjoy this book very much. I think for me, it was mainly that these characters in the story felt underdeveloped to my liking. I had a hard time connecting with some of the characters, which made the story ultimately built to be a bit underwhelming to me. Definitely had potential, and I know a lot of people really enjoyed it, and it is award nominated, but I was ultimately disappointed. The Haunting of Velkwood is a ghost story about a suburban block known as the Velkwood vicinity and its inhabitants that mysteriously vanished behind a mysterious barrier that only 3 young survivors are able to cross. What happened is a mystery to scientists and occult experts for 20 years until one of the survivors agrees to a researcher to re-enter her neighborhood to find answers. It was an original approach to utilizing ghost stories as an analogy for grief and trauma, and the author does a great job at portraying the trauma of the girls' childhood and the impact on their adulthoods. It's also a story of female friendships and queer relationships, which was compelling, but as a whole, the book left me underwhelmed. Particularly underwhelming as a horror novel. I gave The Haunting of Velkwood 2 stars, but don't let that scare you off of reading it. If it sounds like your cup of tea, or if you've heard good things from readers you trust, definitely check it out. Next up is a book I read for my vampire video, but I didn't end up mentioning it because I did not enjoy the book enough to recommend it in that context. This was Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright. This was the first book that Poppy Z. Bright published in 1992, and I'm inclined to think that the pieces of this that I didn't enjoy are at least part due to his inexperience at the time. I mean, it is undeniable that the prose in this is incredible, but to me the pacing of the book just felt a bit off, and there was some unnecessary filler that I didn't feel like served the story, and some problematic topics that I thought were inappropriately utilized. This is a book about touring goth bands, teenage fans, and vampires in New Orleans. There are a few character storylines going on in this, but the central story seems to be about a teenage boy named Nothing, who meets a trio of vampires and goes on a road trip with them as their paths eventually cross with a goth band that Nothing is a fan of named Lost Souls. Like I said, the writing was really what set this book apart for me. But in addition to its beautiful writing, it was also bloody, violent, and vividly erotic. It was equal parts upsetting and alluring. It strikes an impressive balance between the tropes of a seductive vampire and a monstrous vampire, with erotic scenes gradually or suddenly becoming gorefests. Poppy Z. Bright is a trans man, and this novel certainly takes on queer themes, with vampires serving as a metaphor for the marginalization of queer folk, in addition to some interesting analysis on addiction. And violent pregnancy is a key part of the plot, which speaks to a unique trans man experience or fear, which is an experience I can never fully understand, but unfortunately this brings me to some of my larger critiques, which is how the novel treats women. The women in this novel are treated terribly and are portrayed as shallow compared to male counterparts, and there are not so subtle undertones of victim blaming and the horrendous things that happen to them. One of our main characters is a violent rapist showing no accountability, and for some reason he's the closest thing to a hero of the story. In addition to the misogyny and rape, there's also a ton of pedophilia and incest for good measure. But despite these faults, I was still able to find a good amount to enjoy in this as a vampire novel, and I gave it 2.5 stars overall. Unless I'm missing something, I just think this book didn't age very well, unfortunately. I will, however, plan to read more from Poppy Z. Bright in the future because I did appreciate his writing. Next up is This Skin Was Once Mine and Other Disturbances by Eric LaRocca, which is a horror story collection. I read it because one of the stories, called All the Parts of You That Won't Easily Burn, was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. This story was ultimately my favorite of the four in the collection, and I think it is deserving of the nomination. In this story, a man goes to buy a knife for his husband to use at an upcoming dinner party. He encounters a strange shopkeeper who draws him into an intoxicating new obsession and sets him down a path towards mutilation and destruction. This one, like the rest of the collection, was very dark and certainly nauseating. I won't spoil what happens, but it introduces a tangible discomfort very early in the story and gradually ramps up the pain as the story progresses. In addition to that story, I also really enjoyed the one called Seedling, which looked at familial trauma and grief in a father-son relationship, but used some incredibly grotesque body horror to make its point. It is notable that all four stories take an incredibly dark twist at the end, but I really only enjoyed these two stories, unfortunately. The title story, This Skin Was Once Mine, was alright to me, but the last story, Prickle, was the shortest, but it frustrated me. It seemed purposeless and poorly written compared to the rest, and the twist at the end just seemed like it was shocking just for the sake of being shocking. Some might appreciate it, but it was not for me. But in the end, I think Eric LaRocca has a gift, and I'd definitely be interested to read more from him based upon how much I enjoyed the stories in here that I did. I gave the collection as a whole 3 stars. Next up, I want to tell you about Certain Dark Things by Silvio Moreno Garcia. I covered this in my vampire video, so check that out for my extended thoughts, but I really enjoyed this. It is set in a world where humans are made aware of the existence of vampires in the 70s, and Mexico has been overrun by vampire gangs due to lenient policies on vampirism. Our main protagonist is Atul, who is a vampire native to the area, inspired by Aztec folklore of bloodthirsty monsters that can grow bird wings. And she's on the run because European vampires known as Necros are taking over. Atul meets and befriends an impoverished teenager named Domingo, who agrees to help her escape the Necros and law enforcement in Mexico City. It is an urban fantasy novel with a great world building and told from multiple perspectives that gave the story an epic scope and a neo-noir vibe. It was a thrilling and compelling story, which I gave 4 stars and highly recommend it. Next up is The City and Its Uncertain Walls, which is the most recent novel by Haruki Murakami, one of my favorite modern novelists. It is translated from Japanese by Philip Gabriel. Much like other books by Murakami, it is difficult to describe. This book is about 2 worlds, one real and one fantastical, and a fantastical city with unicorns, beasts, and libraries of dreams that exists in our world but is separated by an uncertain wall. And throughout this novel, we see life on both sides of the wall, and the barrier between reality and unreality blurs until we can no longer distinguish the difference. Or rather, blurs such that the difference no longer matters. It is a story of love and loss, the living and the dead, and a search for meaning in the chaos and absurdity of modern life. It's a novel split into 3 parts, with the first section being the most interesting to me and technically impressive. This section tells of life within the walled-off fantastical city as our first-person protagonist must separate from his shadow to enter the city and work as a librarian at the Library of People's Dreams. In this first section, he recounts stories of his childhood love, who he tells about in the second person as if you, the reader, are his lost love. This lover was detached from reality and eventually goes missing without a trace. And the emotion and themes that Murakami addressed in this section was expertly done. The second section concerns our protagonist's life after leaving the walled city and his monotonous life at a small town library. This section represents what we would consider the real world, but Murakami utilizes absurdity and magical elements to really blur the lines between what we consider real and fantasy. It is a story of self-discovery and in many ways acts as a thesis statement for magical realism and how writers like him and Gabriel Garcia Marquez view the world that we share. It has that Murakami charm that I fell in love with, but this isn't going to impress anyone who have historically not liked his writing. While the disagreeable portrayal of women is toned down, though not completely absent, from this novel, this is a long book and it really lingers in the monotony of its second section. Some might call it aimless, but I think the abstract nature of the story really lends itself to introspection. I loved it because I'm a fan of his writing. It's not my favorite novel of his, but probably not my least favorite either. I gave The City and Its Uncertain Walls by Haruki Murakami a strong 4-star rating. Next up is another book I covered in my vampire video. I read Let the Right One In by John Lindquist. This book is set in 1980s Stockholm and 12-year-old boy Oscar, who is bullied at school. He meets a mysterious girl named Ellie who only comes out at night, and the story is centered around their friendship, which is compelling enough on its own, but it's so much more than that. It looks at issues of bullying, alcoholism, pedophilia, and self-harm, so it's a difficult book to read and it is incredibly bleak. But the novel creates a tense atmosphere and moments of violence and gore that lingered with me long after I finished. I really enjoyed this book, so check out my vampire video for my extended thoughts, but in the end I gave this book 4 stars. Next up is Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. This was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, and I offered my extended thoughts on that video. It is a book that markets itself as a twist on the cursed film genre, and I think that it delivers on that promise. This book is hard to put into words, but I found it to be such a good reading experience because of how unconventional this was. The story follows the attempted remake of an infamous horror movie from 1993, which was never completed due to traumatic incidences that are gradually hinted at throughout the book. The lasting surviving member of the original cast and crew details the making of the original film and the process of getting the remake off the ground, but tells the story in a scattered, puzzle-like narrative structure, jumping between time, including segments of the film's script, as lines between real life and the film get incredibly blurry. It's a pretty divisive book online, with a lot of people not liking it, but I thought it was great. A bit of a slow burn, and a bit more cerebral than it is scary, but the creative and experimental way that it tackles its themes of fear, horror fandom, capitalism, bullying, and teenage angst made this a standout book for me. I'm glad to see Paul Tremblay was nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for this one, and I gave it 4 stars. Next up is another book I covered in the Bram Stoker nominee video, House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias. The story follows 5 teenage boys living in Puerto Rico who seek vengeance when one of their mothers is murdered in an act of gang violence. The story is part coming-of-age story, part crime story, and part supernatural horror story set while a dangerous hurricane blows through Puerto Rico. My favorite part of this book is its characters, which Iglesias puts a lot of care into crafting, making them believable and easy to empathize with. I absolutely adored these characters. In addition to great characters, this book was also beautifully written, juxtaposing the gritty story with lush prose. Iglesias is an amazing storyteller, and this was a story of grief and brotherhood that was bloody, violent, and beautiful. I highly recommend this book to horror fans, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I read James by Percival Everett. This is a reinterpretation of Mark Twain's story of Huckleberry Finn, but this time we are told the story from the perspective of the enslaved man, Jim, or James as he prefers to be called in this novel. This book was recently awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and I think that the book was quite good and deserving of the award. This is the first book of his that I've read, and it's his most recent publication and also his most commercially successful. But I know that he is a well-respected author with works over the years such as The Trees, I Am Not Sidney Poitier, and Erasure, which became the basis of the movie American Fiction, which is a great movie if you haven't seen it. And I hope to read all of these works because I really enjoyed James. And I know many fans of his, or literary fans more generally, indicate that this is not even his best work. And this Pulitzer is well earned more for as a lifetime achievement for all the times that he's been passed on the award over the years. Now, I've not read Huckleberry Finn since my high school years, but from what I understand, this is pretty closely follows the outline of the original Mark Twain story. James travels on the Mississippi River with Huck Finn in pursuit of freedom from slavery, and the eventual goal of also buying freedom of his wife and daughter. Changing the perspective to that of James changes the story significantly, especially with how Everett recreates the character as a highly intelligent, and the shallow characterization we know from Twain's story is performative act when he's around white characters in the story. It's a fascinating concept and makes a lot of sense as to why this was such a commercial success. The book is both harrowing and satirical, which does make it somewhat tonally jarring at points, but not to any significant detriment to my reading experience. It all appears very intentional. Everett captures the style and whimsical tone of Mark Twain, all while exploring the dehumanization of slavery with honesty. He was able to lovingly subvert the cultural impact and acclaim of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and transcend the boundaries around James in the original story. Huckleberry Finn was progressive for the year it was published, but in the modern day we can see and understand the problematic minstrel-like portrayal of Jim in the original story. I think this book is very successful at what Percival Everett is trying to accomplish. It is a fantastic reworking of the original, which breathes new life into James's character and made the story ever its own. I think this is well deserving of the respect and accolades it's been receiving, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next up is a fantasy science fiction book that absolutely blew me away with its world building. That is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy, of which I am nearly done with the second book at the time of recording this. It is set in a fantasy world called The Stillness, which is plagued by natural disasters and regular apocalyptic events, which the inhabitants of the world call Fifth Seasons. Within this world, there is a group of people called Origines that have the ability to control seismic activities within their environment. The Origines are feared and hated due to the terrifying, though societally necessary powers, and they are controlled and oppressed by a caste of people called the Guardians. It is a large and complex world, and I appreciate how little hand-holding or over-explaining was done to help the reader understand the world and the story. Because of this, it does take a while to get hooked by the book, but once you are, it makes the whole lead-up and experience way more rewarding. So I won't reveal much else about the world or the plot, but instead encourage you to go in with little information. The story was profound and haunting with its themes and was incredibly written. It was often quite dark, which pleases a reader like me, and it speaks on topics of power, oppression, cannibalism, breeding, and slavery. The characters were complex and nuanced, and the narrative voice that Jemisin wrote with perfectly portrayed this. It is an incredibly creative story that subverts fantasy tropes and readers' expectations to make a unique reading experience. I think it's a perfect introduction to the world, and is a story that I just think continues to get better in book 2. I gave The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin 4.5 stars. Last up, my favorite book I read in April and May is The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman. This is another vampire story I read for my vampire video, and this one blew me away. And I'm excited to read more from Christopher Buehlman in the future. The Lesser Dead is set in New York City in the 70s and follows a teenage vampire named Joey, who has spent the past 40 years living in a community of vampires in the subway. The story is told from Joey's first-person perspective, and his narrative voice was so entertaining. He has a lot of personality. His sense of humor is showcased in the narration, and I really enjoyed his perspective on the day-to-day life as a vampire. Conversational narrative style definitely can be hit or miss for me, but this narration was a hit. It was so engaging. A lot of the book is non-linear and somewhat aimless, but it remained entertaining because of the narration. Joey's undead life is pretty good until one day he encounters vampire children on the subway that changes the whole course of Joey's story. It's a short, fast-paced book that goes all out on gore and action in its memorable climax. If you prefer vampires that are gritty and brutal, this is definitely a book for you. I could not put this book down. It was a fun modern take on the vampires that plays with readers' expectations with plenty of twists and turns. It strikes an impressive balance of horror and dark humor, and I highly recommend it for all types of horror fans because it was so dang entertaining. I gave The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman 4.5 stars as my favorite book I read in April and May. And that's all the books I read these past 2 months. Thank you so much for hanging out and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss my next video. Remember to check out my most recent videos on the vampire novel and 2024 Bram Stoker Award nominees if they sound interesting to you. But until next time, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on any of these or whatever books you've been loving lately. As always, happy reading everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.